I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. It is Paul Marshall, who is the Wilson Professor at Baylor University and a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, as well as a contributing editor at Providence Magazine, which I would just like you all to know that there is also a magazine that goes along with this conference. The website is provmagazine.com, and if you've enjoyed the speakers you've heard today and yesterday, you'd like to hear more perspectives along the realist lines that you've heard, I would highly encourage you to keep up with the magazine. We have a new article every weekday, and be part of the Providence community. We have many events here in DC if you're in DC now or moving soon. So yeah, I just hope you keep in touch with us even after this conference. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, I hope you at the back have good eyesight, because we will be looking at, I hope we'll be looking at maps. Anyway, while we're doing this, my topic will be understanding Muslim-Christian conflict, lessons of history. And I want to stress that theme of history because except in the South, Americans don't pay much attention to history. Whereas if you're dealing with particularly the Muslim majority world, people are immersed in it and speak in those particular terms. In the Gulf War, or even now with Hamas, there are all sorts of historical allusions being made, which we miss. And so, indeed, a book I would recommend to you by Ambrose Bierce, written I think over 100 years ago, called The Devil's Dictionary. A very cynical dictionary, and delightfully funny. Under the heading of war, it reads the follows. War. War is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Oh, something, I'm afraid, too true to be entirely funny. But the same thing could probably be said of history. Now, are we having any...
Sarah went to get technical help.
Oh, okay. It's difficult without the maps. So we have a pattern of a particular conflict with, we call it the Muslim majority world, and then what term do we use for the rest? Often it's sort of Islam versus the West, and I remember the late Bernard Lewis says, this is a peculiar conflict. It's a religion versus a point of the compass. And what are we going to say about what the West is? But without the illusions, without the illustrations of the map, let me mention this. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad, born in 570, Muhammad was not only in the sort of Western sense of that word, a religious teacher, but he was also a military leader, led armies in battles, and he was a political leader. At the time of his death, they controlled an area in the middle of the... Are we getting... Hold on. Thank you. Going back to this, I started thinking about this talk about a month ago. And I thought, I want to talk about Islamic things, but nobody's interested in that because it's China, China, China. Very properly, and then the Ukraine, and dealing with Russia. So I thought, obviously, with the Hamas attacks, we're now very interested in that. But I did want to put up a couple of maps here to make some of these points. In dealing with the Middle East, here, dealing with red, you're looking at Salafi jihadi movements. That is, those were the particular ideology of Islamic conquests. There may be other movements in this area who are interested in more local territorial matters, but this is ones with overarching world historical goals. So in the Middle East, here in South Asia, there's different shades. The redder it is, the worse it is. Red means there's active attacks going on, others are collecting things, or there are active groups which can add. And let me just finish up. Peter Fan gave us a great introduction to Africa. This is Africa, Salafi Jihadi movement. Over half the territory of Africa, these groups are operating, as far down as South Africa. And that's been a major change in the last 20 years. So this is not just a phenomenon in the Middle East, but something which goes much more widely. Now to the historical things. At the time of Muhammad's birth, the controlling power in that area was the Byzantine Empire, that is the Eastern Roman Empire. All the colored areas in here are part of that empire, and as you know, it survived till 1453. But here is, going back to where I was earlier, the very dark purple here, at the time of Muhammad's death, this is probably the area under the control of Muslims. That's the deep purple. At the sort of not so deep purple here is Islamic expansion by the year 660. That's 30 years later. If we start to include the very light colors here, this takes us to about 720, which means 100 years after the Islamic prophet's death. They actually, at this point, they moved higher up to Poitiers. But you had Muslim Arab armies. In 100 years, Muslim Arab armies operating in central France and China and controlling all the area in between. This is quite an amazing expansion. And one shouldn't say that sort of, well, there's something peculiar about the Arabs in this. If the Byzantines could have done it, they would. I mean, that's what empires do. So you have this expansion. It continues. Here is a map. I'm not sure if you can see the green lines here. But of the world within that green line here, those are the areas under Muslim control by the year 1100. Let's move ahead to 1500. Same map. You've had the Reconquista in Spain. So the Moorish armies had been driven out. They'd lost that area. But expansion across the Sahara and the Sahel, right down East Africa, controlling here, controlling now most of the Indian subcontinent over into Indonesia. The map's wrong, it should include the southern Philippines. Penetration into Central Asia, into Russia, and then at this point with the collapse of the Byzantines, moving into Eastern and Central Europe. So this is an area of, this would be the area of Muslim control in the year 1500. Okay, it's not all one state, they're fighting within each other, but that's an area where, who's in charge of this place? It's Muslims. So, and if you're a Muslim, you look at this and say, the truth has won out. Almost from the beginning with, some of the pushback in Spain, the true religion has shown itself in world history by almost 1,000 years of continuous expansion. And not just militarily, this was culturally the most powerful. It was the richest, probably the most cultured in terms of literature, philosophy, and other things. So you have this confidence in your religion. In simple terms, 1,000 years of almost continual success. And then it changed. Obviously, history doesn't change on a dime. It happened. You start to lose some battles, then you start to lose more than you win, and the tide begins to change. If I took one symbolic date for the sort of the height of sort of Islamic expansion, it would be September the 11th, 1683. That's a fairly arbitrary date, but you will remember it because of the September 11th. At this point, Turkish, Ottoman armies were laying siege to Vienna. Okay, again, they'd done this before. And, but they got defeated. Next day, September the 12th, defeated by Polish and other armies. And it wasn't just, hey, we lost a battle, but that defeat led to further pushback. And driven out of Austria, then driven out of Hungary. So what you had was, firstly, a pushback by European powers down through Central Europe and pushing back through the Balkans, places such as Hungary, Serbia, later on Bulgaria, Romania. Sort of Islamic control is being lost in these particular areas. A second wave of European, or Muslims would see it with some validity, of Christian expansion and imperialism. Firstly, the pushback in Europe, but then around the peripheries of this world. Firstly, you have Russia moving into Central Asia, taking up control of places we now call Kazakhstan, Turkestan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. Then the European powers begin to take over portions of Africa. Italy and France and Spain begin to take over these areas and down there. The British move into Nigeria and a lot of these particular areas. Then the British take over India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. The Dutch take over Indonesia. The British take over Malaysia. So what is happening with the phenomena called, often now called colonialism, there's a takeover of these areas around the Muslim world. They were taking over from Muslim rulers. That's who was dominant in India at the time. So what you're getting is a sort of whole-scale change of now European Christian powers displacing Muslim rulers throughout the world. And this process, after 1,000 years of stunning success, and you start to get these things. So here you have a map illustrating all the areas of the world at one time under Muslim rule. Not necessarily majority Muslim population, but that's who is in charge there. But then you get a shrinkage. This is 1925. Where are Muslims, what are the Muslim majority places being run by Muslims? Well, as we mentioned with India, Indonesia, places in Asia, places in Africa, well, they're getting run by Christians. In the Middle East itself, the British are sort of basically ruling Egypt and Yemen and so forth. The places which were maintained their independence were Central Arabia, soon to become Saudi Arabia, and then Afghanistan. These are about the only, of course you had Iran, but it's getting pretty secular. You have Turkey, which is extremely secular, makes France look like it's ultramontane Catholicism. So they may be a majority Muslim, but there's nothing much Islamic about the government. So, and who is actually running this place? Well, here's these places. I'm not sure if you can see the Union Jack, Union Jack, Union Jack, Union Jack, France, Spain, others. That's who's running the Middle East. So you have those threefold, I'll call it Christian expansion. Firstly, the pushback out of Europe, expansion into the Islamic periphery, Central Asia, Africa, Asia, and then finally a takeover of the Islamic heartland itself. So if you're a Muslim looking at all this, what do you think? Why are people angry? He says, well, they took us over with the phenomena we call colonialism. By the way, as an aside, I think colonialism is a very misleading word because it tries to take European expansion, European imperialism, as if it were distinct from other imperialisms. It was distinct in one respect. It was largely done by sea around that, whereas most empires expand land. You take over your neighbor and then take over. So colonialism sort of wrenches out European imperialism as if it were a distinct phenomena in the world, other than by the fact it was maritime. We have the Ottoman Empire. We have the Russian Empire. We don't call it that, but Russia expanded for several centuries, about 50 square miles a day, and all the way to the Pacific. So there's lots of imperialisms going on there that needs to be remembered. But in terms of, if you're a Muslim looking at this, what happens now is saying, well, you have taken over our countries. You have dominated them. Our response could be, let's go back to those earlier maps. It says, well, you did it to us first. You'll probably know you did it first is usually not a very effective argument in almost any setting. But still, the picture I'm trying to give you is that pattern of Muslim Islamic success followed by crippling failure at the hand of, what do we call it, Europe, the West, Christendom, or whatever. And this has caused many things, because it's more recent in the Islamic world, tremendous resentment. We could use go back one. If you just take the Middle East saying, well, that's where we were 100 years ago, and you did it. So this has produced a lot of anger and frustration within Muslims saying, why, if this is the true religion, the religion which was dominant, the religion which was successful for a millennium, 1,000 years, why have we become crippled and at the bottom of all the league tables in the last 300 years? And so there's a debate, many debates about this. One of them is that we became closed-minded. We refused to learn. We lost critical thinking and science and culture. And so we became primitive, and that's why we lost to the European powers. Another response is the opposite, is we became bad Muslims. When we were truly faithful and followed the way of the Prophet and were disciplined and committed, we were successful. But now we have gone chasing after false gods. We have sought to imitate the Western powers, brought in false and heretical doctrines like nationalism or democracy, or various forms of critical thinking. And that's what's destroyed us. What do we need to do then? Then we need to get back to an original, true, pure Islam. Salafists, the original followers of Muhammad in the first generations. So we need a purified Islam, and then we can go from that to back to this again, and then carry on. Some examples of this. Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a radical movement, has been violent in some places, not in others. But this is their map of the caliphate. Looks very familiar to the red one you just looked at. This is ISIS. This is their map. Okay, so these are movements saying we need to get back to pure Islam to recapture the Muslim world from these infidel controllers, and then get back with the program and continue our expansion. So, and when you're getting more radical forms of Islam, including but not restricted to terrorism, this is the sort of agenda and underlying picture you see. And in terms of the historical examples, it's not a stupid view of history. If you read through, say, Osama bin Laden, he describes these particular things. So where does that leave us? We're dealing with ISIS. As you can see from the earlier maps, very widespread Al-Qaeda and the original map of Africa, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups, extremely active in the Indian subcontinent and also in the Middle East. Some comment, and then I'll open us to questions. Where does Hamas fit in this? Well, it is a group like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, not only in its tactics, but in its worldview. It is not a Palestinian nationalist movement. It believes nationalism is a heresy. People should not be organized according to particular nations, but according to Islam. It is not a movement for democracy. Democracy is a heresy. It's quite explicit in its charters. It is one of these types of movements, and it commits itself not to negotiate, but to wage war. And when you see people saying, you know, Hamas is fighting against colonial settlers or whatever, Hamas may use this for public consumption in the West, but they're quite explicit in Arabic writings that this is an Islamic agenda to restore control, again, sort of west of the Jordan River, but to continue that expansion and to get rid of groups which are not with the program, such as the PLO. It killed the PLO representatives in Gaza. So as we look at increasing tensions in the Middle East, but throughout Africa, the Indian subcontinent, even in the southern Philippines. It was little reported, but ISIS-affiliated groups took over a town of 250,000 people in the southern Philippines. This was now about 4 years ago, and held it for 2 months. So this is going on throughout the world. So be aware of this extent. In terms of understanding much of the Muslim world, to get some sense of this history of success and failure, but also being victimized, which they were being victimized. So we need to acknowledge that. So there's that history behind us and that continual conflict. The question before us is, how do we end this? And the first step in that is to realize what this cycle has been and what this history has been, and not keep projecting some more recent secular mindsets on a conflict which is not reduced to religion, but which has strong religious roots. Let's open it up to questions. Thank you. Sorry? Oh, okay. Stunned silence.
Thank you, Professor Marshall, for
Okay.
a wonderful speech. I actually saw this coming before you were speaking. So my conclusion is, so I have two questions for you. Number one, the ideas of Islamic fundamentalism stemmed from Iran after the 1979 revolution. So if we agree to treat the problem by treating the root cause of it, do you suggest using covert action against the state of Iran to remove the threat forever? And number two, I'm actually find it very interesting because there's also another branch of Christian fundamentalism within the United States. It's counter-cultural protest against the modern society. And what I'm seeing is that there are a lot of Christians out there who is using a biblical worldview to interpret reality that could also lead to very dangerous act just like this. So how do we as Christians make sure that we do not fall into like fundamentalist propaganda? Yeah.
Okay, firstly, a word on fundamentalism. Doesn't worry me a bit that people are fundamentalist. It's what they're fundamentalist about. And it's not the strength of their conviction, but the content of their creed, to sort of paraphrase Martin Luther King. The Amish are fundamentalists. Nobody is lying awake at night worrying that the Amish are going to kill them in their beds. Okay? So it's the content of the belief. So we've got to be careful about that. If you're looking at, say, Americans with a sort of prophetic agenda, trying to read the signs of the time through biblical prophecy, I would say in general, prophecy is not a guide to anything. I should do that in terms of shaping our hearts and minds, yes. But the fact that something may be prophesied, if we're using it in the sense of prediction rather than a clarifying word, the fact that something is prophesied doesn't mean it's a good thing. I mean, Israel was prophesied they'd be taken captive into Babylon. It didn't mean you should encourage that process. So I usually say, in our conduct, we are guided by God's commandments. The prophetic outcome will be in God's hands. Okay, so that would be my sort of general response to that means of doing that. In terms of sort of covert action and fighting, yeah, we've been involved in that sometimes, often unwisely. I wouldn't want to get now into particular sort of tactics and strategy, but to realize some of the underlying tensions and conflicts here, and that other people, to escape what often gets called mirror imaging, that is to assume that the people you're opposed to or you're cooperating with see the world the same way that you do. We do this all the time with Iran. So they're thinking that they're looking for what we're looking for. So we need to get beyond that. And then it came up when Peter Pham was talking, someone had mentioned from the back, of a secular mindset, especially prevalent in the chattering classes, which includes sort of diplomats, many think tankers, and journalists, to disregard religion. And this is very dangerous. The assumption is always that people are guided by money, sex, and power. And so, well, they are, but money, sex, power, and faith. You have to realize that often people do things because they believe that's what God wants them to do. Suicide bombers are not in it for the money. Okay? Now, you could say, yeah, they pay off the family if it's poor. Yeah, but I mean, you don't kill yourself for earthly reward. So we've got to get out of that particular mindset. One quick story by, I've forgotten the name, but at the time of the, what it looked like revolution was brewing in Iran in 1979, there was a proposal made to the CIA that they studied the religious ideas of the mullahs and so on, were actually people like Khomeini. This was turned down. It was Edward Luttwak, that's it, who writes about it, and I think he's the one who made the proposal. It was turned down by the CIA on the grounds that it would be mere sociology, that is, irrelevant academic verbiage, which is not a bad definition of sociology, but was missing the point. So there was no intensive study because they said, well, what are the military doing? What are the merchants doing? The working class? Are these groups? The power centers of a society. Where are they? They all looked fairly stable, so the assumption was that the Shah was going to be okay. There were just these mad mullahs running around with mobs, but they were just sort of religious throwbacks, reactionaries, and really can't shape the modern world. So, unexpectedly to American intelligence, this revolution took place in Iran. But this had certain consequences. You might remember, boy, you won't because you weren't even born till 2 decades afterwards, but the Iranian hostage crisis. That is, they took over the American embassy and took dozens of American diplomats and others hostage and seized a lot of documents. The question is, why were those people, I'm not talking about the Iranians, I'm talking about the Americans, why were they in the embassy? I mean, when someone is threatening a revolution and calls you the great Satan who deserves death, usually you get most of your diplomatic staff out of there, maybe a couple remain in case it doesn't go. But by and large, we did not take steps. To evacuate that, we also lost lots of documents, so that led to a hostage crisis, which may have led to Ronald Reagan's election. So it's important to take religion seriously. Okay, any other questions?
Actually, Dr. Marshall, I have a question, if that's okay. Thank you for the history of talking about like the battle of Tours, the battle at Vienna 200 years ago. And you talked about Islam's own self-identification as like the religion of these victorious military conquerors. That was true for about 1,000 years. So in the United States, especially among Protestants, we don't like to directly identify states with God or Christianity. It feels a little wrong out of space. At the same time, I think everyone would say, yes, we're glad that the European Christians won at Tours and at Vienna when those battles took place. And so it feels like kind of a tension, basically, because on one hand, well, yes, I am like happy to see that history turned out in certain ways according to the relationship between Christianity and states. But at the same time, I see the way that in Islam is described, things went great for 1,000 years, and then they didn't. And then I wonder the degree to which Muslims today can, that justification no longer works. Like if they're no longer the religion of the conquerors, you can see how identifying a religion too much with military victories and stuff like that clearly can go awry. So what do you think of that tension?
The tension between identifying the West as Christian, or
between I don't want to identify Christianity to like the West or a certain battle or a certain army or certain king. I can see how it goes wrong. But at the same time, I am glad to say that at Vienna or at Tours, that's Christianity. They did it militarily, but I don't want Christianity to be decided by like military victories, even though that turns out that way sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just a couple of comments. The phenomena of Christianity becoming a largely European religion in the 11th, 12th, 13th century is because of the largely eradication of Christianity in Asia and much of Africa. I mean, there were many Christians in China in the 7th century. Genghis Khan's mother, was it his mother? No, one of his wives was a Christian. So Christianity was very widespread in Asia. The idea that it just spread into Europe is later. So the historically, the identification with Christianity and Europeanness is false. It was, I like to say, Christianity was in Africa before Europe. It was in India before England, and it was in China before America. So that's one thing. In terms of not identifying us or the West with Christianity, I think that's true. I mean, it's a complex relation. There are certainly Christian features which have shaped societies in the West which are beneficial and which we should recognize. Now, with strong secularization, it's hard to keep up that identification. But one thing that's important for many Muslims, I'm not necessarily talking about particular Muslim intellectuals, and there's very good analyses of these, but for many Muslims will describe the West in religious terms. It's Christian. And so that means you'll often meet in parts of the world, what do people associate with Christianity? Sexual license, homosexuality, pornography, alcohol. Why? Well, that's what the West is pushing on us, and the West is Christian. So you'll often see that sort of identification. So we should be very careful about, the sort of West, Europe, Christian, putting that too closely. But also to be aware that many other people in the world do tend to put those together. Okay, and there was someone over there.
Hello, Devin Burnett from Liberty University. And my question is, I understand that not all Arabs or Muslims are keen on the same agenda with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I was wondering, how can we convince the Muslims and the other Arabs who aren't radical, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, to embrace more of a Western view on like government and in peace?
Not sure I can give a quick answer to that. Two authors I would recommend. I'm not sure whether. One is Shadi Hamid. He's at Brookings Institute, a Muslim theorist. I'm not sure if he's spoken at this conference, but he's certainly published in Providence. Have a look at some of his writings, particularly Islamic exceptionalism, which deals with some of these at a much more complex level. I mean, I have to emphasize, I just did 1,400 years of world history in 20 minutes, so I oversimplified. But to get some of the complexities, look at some of Shadi's stuff. And then Ahmad Kuru, UC San Diego, Kuru, K-U-R-U. Can't remember the name of the book, but he's been analyzing why the strength of authoritarianism, particularly in the Middle East, and complex factors. And he said it's when the Islamic teachers began to get too close to their governments. Beforehand, they were something of an opposition. But I would look at those two authors to get to some of the subtleties here. In terms of how do we shape Muslim public opinion, firstly, be aware that our ability to do so is limited. Second, that's a major thing to deal with, that Muslims need to deal with. And that's a reason I'm particularly interested in Indonesia. But one could look at West Africa. It was Peter Pham mentioned Senegal again, one of the freest countries in the world, 90% Islamic. You'll find a lot of freedom historically in West African Islam. India has probably the second largest Muslim population in the world. There's tensions, there's riots, but you're not getting sort of pan-Islamic terrorist groups coming up in India. Not too many in Bangladesh. And Indonesia, by population, the world's largest Muslim country, I'm particularly interested in. And their strong stress on rejecting what other people call sort of Islamization in Indonesia. They say, where you're getting more radical currencies. That's not Islamicization. We're already Muslims. That's Arabization. That's Middle Easterners equating their cultural inheritance with Islam. So we're as Islamic as they are. And by the way, by most of the measures, they tend to be more pious. That is, if you pray 5 times a day, do you pay zakat, and that sort of thing. So I'm interested in outreach by Islamic organizations, particularly Nahdlatul Ulama, with about 90 million followers, is the world's largest Muslim organization. That is now quite aggressive in pushing what it calls middle path Islam Wasatiyah. So to encourage the sort of, I don't want to call them the peripheries, that's where the people are, but other Islamic countries to seek to see if they can reshape the Middle East. Because most of the problems within the Islamic world now are Middle Eastern problems. You take the Middle East out of the equation and you'll find majority Muslim African countries and non-Muslim African countries very similar. Similarly, a lot of Asian things. So that's not to say there aren't problems elsewhere, but there's a Middle East concentration. So needs to be addressed there. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Kate Wright, and my question pertains to the Holy Land, the significance of Judea and Samaria for Christians, and of course, thank you very much to our ancestors who were Jewish that gave us this wonderful tradition. And the Muslim original even moment that they appeared was 680. But the significance of this is endless for us. And the importance of the Crusades to try to recover the Holy Land during this, as well as the significance of Judea and Samaria today.
Okay, in terms of Christian and Jewish history and inheritance and belief, very important. Enough people argue that historically it's been much less significant to Muslims, and I was going to mention one other thing in relation to that, and I've forgotten. Sorry. Take one more. Ray at the back.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. My name is Ian DeYoung. I'm from Redeemer University. It's my understanding that it's been 30 years since Samuel P. Huntington has published Clash of Civilizations. Looking back on that, do you think this is still a helpful framework for looking at Islam's relationship with the rest of the world?
If used cautiously, yes. I think the basic pattern we're seeing is if you start to look at the Muslim world, and again that's stretching from the Atlantic through to the Pacific. There's tremendous variation in that, but you do see historical religions shape cultures and mindsets, so you will see differences in there. If we look at China, again, another complex place, but China calls itself the Middle Kingdom. It sits in the middle of the world, and everybody else is peripheral around them. And for much of its history, that's been the structural reality. For the last couple of 100 years, it hasn't been. It's been sidelined. So for China, it believes the world is now coming back to normal. and China's centrality will once again be relevant in history. They're a very similar pattern with the Iranians. So that you also see this very much with the Russian propaganda. But it's not just propaganda, it resonates with many Russians. The Russian world, the Russian form of civilization is very much opposed to the West. Putin pushes this, but it resonates with Russians. So you see these civilizational tensions becoming much stronger. And to that extent, I believe that Huntington was right. But a caution, I've seen people attack Huntington, attack his views, when what they're actually doing is agreeing with them. They're saying, the implication was that sort of Huntington was like advocating civilizational war. It was a caution. He said, these tensions do not assume that these people see the world the same way as we do. Do not assume that if they don't now, they quickly will. But there are tensions there, so we need to tread cautiously. So that was a call not to arms, but a call to caution, that we should not go blundering around the world, again, mirror imaging all these other different cultures. And there I'll stop. Thank you.
Paul,
Oh.
our food is not served yet, so if there's another question.
Oh, okay. They're all disappointed now and have low blood sugar.
Thank you very much. I know the talk is focused on Muslim-Christian conflict, but would you say that the Crusades or the Mongol sacking of Baghdad probably has a heavier weight in Islamic historical content?
You might notice in my history I never mentioned the Crusades, because they were largely, that was the thing coming up, they were largely irrelevant. I mean, they didn't have much. The big fuss about the Crusades is sort of come up in the last 100 years, again, trying to say, well, this is, the Western colonialists are bad. To quote Bernard Lewis, the Crusades were a short-lived, failed attempt to recover some lands back from Islam. Muslims didn't mean much, they won. So the Crusaders had a few places there, but were driven out. Historically, with the sorts of, let's go back to, oh, it's died on me again, never mind. Just imagine, we're looking at that map, including Indonesia out here, we're going to Morocco. The Crusades were this little in there. So most of the discussion the Crusaders were often brutal, but the attempt to sort of recover lands when there was increasing repression, particularly of pilgrims, was not itself a colonial enterprise. So. Oh, another one.
I have another question. In terms of relations to the Middle East, what other countries do you think have like a good shot, or maybe a better shot than America does?
Say that again. I'm not sure.
In regards to like enforcing and making better relations in like the Middle Eastern countries, particularly with like Islamic countries, like what countries outside the United States have a better shot of making better relations?
Of having better relations with countries in the Middle East?
Yeah.
The better relations of that country with Middle Eastern countries, or making the region better? mean, China's getting much better relations with the Middle Eastern countries, but my heart does not soar like an eagle, but I
No,
consider
I would
that.
agree too. Maybe say, like, rephrase it this way, like, whether, like, Western country do you see being the most able to have better Western relations with the Middle Eastern Islamic countries?
I'm not sure I see other countries positioned to do better than the United States. There are countries which, in stance, might be better, but they don't have the power or reach that we do. Again, I'd want to emphasize the sort of intra-Muslim dynamics. With places like they're small and weaker, they tend not to have oil, but places like Morocco or Jordan, or the various Asian powers. I would look at that, and we go back to that question which came earlier about the question of Turkey. And I would just echo Rebecca Heinrichs. That's a very difficult problem. So.
I believe the food is arrived. Paul Marshall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.